So for this week, the Climate Prediction Center is still forecasting that there should be an enhanced risk of tropical cyclone development over the main development region. Taking a look at the percentages, we do see that the percentages lie anywhere between 20 to 40% chance of tropical cyclone development over this area, and now we're seeing some of the ensemble members lean a little bit more to tropical storm formation over that area. In terms of what the latest runs of the computer models are stating at this time, we haven't seen many differences compared to yesterday's run. The GFS model is still at least forecasting a tropical storm to develop. However, there is a key difference where now that the GFS model wants to take its trajectory a little bit further northward than compared to yesterday's run, and this is because the GFS model is expecting less amount of ridging to build just to the north of the storm, which should allow the storm to take more of a northward track, which may be good news for the Caribbean islands, but might not be very good news for the southeast in the very long-term future. Of course, it's still way too far to say for certain if this is going to impact the United States in any way, shape, or form. However, it's definitely good to be aware of all the scenarios, even when it's in the long-term future. We see that the GFS model does strengthen this into tropical storm status with its millibar pressure hovering around 1,001 millibars, but eventually it should encounter a strong amount of wind shear over the Caribbean islands, just to the north of the Caribbean islands, and I think that could be a big inhibiting factor as the storm system continues ahead further westward. There's expected to be a very strong upper level low that's going to be located just to the south of Cuba, and that could be enough to tear this storm apart, especially in the upper levels. And it's also due to the fact that the lower level winds are a lot stronger than the upper level winds, which means that the moisture associated in the upper levels of the atmosphere would move a little bit slower than the center of circulation, and that would create a disconnect between the convection as well as the low level center, which means that the energy will be more spread out, the air molecules in general will be more spread out, and that would mean that we will see a weaker tropical cyclone, because a lot of that energy needs to be concentrated over the center of circulation, and the energy needs to be closed in within the eye wall. And if it's a little bit too spread out, then that means the winds won't be really strong enough for this to be considered a tropical storm, and we won't see enough convective activity with less convergence going on over with the energy spread out over a larger area. So that's part of the reason why the GFS model wants to weaken this storm as it approaches the Caribbean, but there could be that possibility it could re-intensify as it approaches the United States if it were to take this trajectory, which, like I said, is still highly uncertain at this time. However, it's good to point out that there could be major changes with the forecast, because just in the prior run, the GFS model was not only expecting a tropical storm, but was expecting to develop a hurricane out of this tropical wave. Let me show you guys the 12Z run right now. So this is what the 12Z run of the GFS model was forecasting at around the same time period, and we clearly see that this storm is much stronger with its millibar pressure hovering around 996 millibars, and even goes beyond that point to where we see the pressure drop down to the 960s, and we see pretty much a worst case scenario for the coast of Florida. But again, super far out. Definitely don't even acknowledge this forecast run because we're going 360 hours out. But even if we were to move into the more short-term future, we see that this storm is at least a stronger tropical storm compared to what the 18Z run is stating. So they're definitely between now and July 27th, when this storm would be located right at the Caribbean's doorstep. There's still a lot of time for the forecast to change between whether or not we could potentially see a hurricane, a tropical storm, or just a regular tropical wave. Still a lot of uncertainty, and the reason why the 12Z run wanted to develop a hurricane as this approaches the United States is due to the fact that the 12Z run expected this upper level low to be a lot weaker, which means that the wind shear would be a lot weaker over this storm as it continues to head on further westward, and the strength of this upper level low will be key in determining how much this strengthens, because there is that possibility that this tropical storm, if it were to develop just to the east of the Caribbean, would disintegrate this storm as it heads towards the just to the north of the Caribbean islands. And if this upper level low becomes weak enough, then that might not happen. Let me show you guys the wind shear map right now. So this is what the GFS model is forecasting when it comes to amount of wind shear as of the 12-0, and we see that the wind shear is fairly light, not only over the main development region, but just to the north of the Caribbean as well, because we see that this upper level low is a lot weaker. This stronger than usual wind shear isn't impacting this storm, and we see that this upper level low just to the northeast of this storm system isn't close enough to bring a strong amount of wind shear, and this strengthens due to the fact that the wind shear is relatively light. We do see a moderate amount of wind shear just to the north of this storm, but it's helping the outflow, which is the reason why the GFS model wanted to develop a very powerful tropical cyclone by this point. But we're just going to need to wait and see if this upper level low will remain weak or will it become stronger than anticipated, because the 18Z run, like I'm going to show you guys right now, is very different. So this is how the same computer model, the GFS model, looks as of the 18Z run when it comes to the amount of wind shear. We see that the wind shear is a lot stronger. This upper level low is a lot stronger, and as a result, it disintegrates the storm as it moves just to the north of the Caribbean islands, and that's certainly a possibility. So we're definitely going to need to pay close attention to how this upper level low will build over the next several days. And unfortunately, it's still a bit too far. Out to say for certain how powerful it'll be, but I'll definitely keep you guys updated. Another significant factor that could impact this storm's intensity is the amount of stability that will exist over the main development region. Taking a look at the relative humidity map provided from the GFS model in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, we do see that associated with this tropical wave, there will be plenty of moisture, and eventually that moisture will consolidate into a smaller area for a well-defined low pressure system and potentially center of circulation to develop. However, it won't be very easy, as the moisture suggests, right over this storm system, because there's plenty of dry air just to the north of this storm system, and there could easily be that possibility the dry air could entrain this storm. And another thing too is that the low level center is expected to move a bit faster than the moisture that would be the convection that would be located in the upper levels of the atmosphere, because if we were to take a look at the soundings, you're going to see that the winds along the surface will be much stronger than the winds you'll see in the upper levels, which will mean that the low level center will move away from all the convection, all the moisture that would be located in the upper levels of the atmosphere. And if enough of a disconnect happens, the good news is that this should definitely help disintegrate this storm, because of course the convective activity as well as the low level center need to be at approximately the same area to maximize the heat engine and the amount of convergence and amount of lift that occurs around the center of circulation and around this storm for the pressure to drop and the winds to increase. But if there's enough of a disconnect where the lower level winds are strong enough to push away the low level center away from the convective activity, then that certainly could help disintegrate this storm and weaken this storm as it approaches the Caribbean. So we're definitely going to need to keep that in mind, as well as the amount of dry air, which will depend on how strong this ridge is, because if this ridge is a little bit stronger, then we should see a stronger amount of wind that would force the Saharan dust to move right over the main development region at a more concentrated rate, which would mean that there would be more of a temperature inversion to stabilize the atmosphere and weaken this storm, which is what the European model is forecasting at this time. Similar to yesterday's run, the European model is forecasting that the dry air should be able to completely diminish this tropical wave's chances of developing as it approaches the Caribbean. We do see that the dry air is a lot more impactful in this scenario from the European model, where we do see that there's plenty of dry air just to the north of this storm. Let me show you guys the 12Z run because it gives the full forecast, but we do see a lot more dry air compared to the GFS model, which means that it'll definitely have a much more difficult time of being able to intensify into a tropical storm with this much dry air, as we do see that the European model doesn't even acknowledge this storm, as there isn't really an icon that shows a well-defined low pressure center, as well as the fact that the greens associated with this moisture are more on the lighter side, which means that there definitely isn't a lot of convective activity going on or a lot of thunderstorm activity anywhere close. That could be considered anywhere close to tropical to this being considered a tropical storm. So that definitely isn't. So this scenario definitely wouldn't lean towards tropical cyclone development if we were to see this much dry air over the main development region. But it's still there's still a lot of days to go with this forecast. But what I could say more confidently is that the Caribbean might get impacted when it comes to heavy rainfall associated with this tropical wave, but it just depends how strong it'll be and also the trajectory, because of course the GFS model does want to steer this a little bit further northward, but depending on how much ridging there is, we could see that move back further southward. Still a lot of days to go, so I'll keep you guys updated, but definitely pay very close attention to how much ridging there is, because if the ridging is a little bit too strong, then we'd see more dry air, and that would definitely inhibit this storm's possibility of developing, because of course associated with a very strong ridge is a high amount of stability as well as sinking air, which is definitely something that tropical waves don't like when it comes to wanting to develop into a tropical storm, because tropical cyclones need a high amount of lift for that water vapor to condense and release latent heat. If there isn't enough lift, or if there's a sinking motion in the atmosphere, that would definitely prevent the very warm and moist air mass along the surface to rise up, condense, and create a tropical cyclone. Taking a look at the 500 millibar height anomaly to show you guys, we do see that with the European model, there's a lot more ridging going on, which is definitely creating a more stable environment and allowing a lot more dry air to exist. But it's definitely not the case with the GFS model, where the ridging is a lot weaker, and we see that eventually the ridging weakens quite a bit, where we do see that there's barely ridging, at least compared to the European model. So we're seeing a lot more lift around the storm system due to that. So the GFS model has been more confident in developing this tropical cyclone than the European model, but we're just gonna need to wait and see if that continues, and which computer model will cave into the other one. And once we see one of the computer models cave in to the other and show they both show a very similar forecast scenario, then I will say a lot more confidently what is going to happen. But it's just a little bit too far, and the computer models still have a pretty big disparity when it comes to trajectory and strength of this specific tropical wave. So it's still a bit uncertain at this time, but I'll keep you guys updated, so stay tuned for more updates. I wish I could give you guys more answers, but it's still very far out. But just be aware, in the Caribbean you could experience heavy rain while there's a tropical storm or tropical wave. Taking a look at the 7-day graphical tropical weather outlook, we do see that it's still fairly quiet, at least outside of tropical depression Dawn, and it's expected to move around like this and could maybe come uncomfortably close to eastern Canada, where at the very least you should expect an enhanced amount of surf. But outside of that, it shouldn't really bring much in terms of impact, so we won't need to worry about tropical depression Dawn that much unless you're in eastern Canada. And then moving southward into the moving towards the southward portion of the northern Atlantic, we still do see that the National Hurricane Center, at least for this next tropical wave, isn't giving a chance of this developing just yet. But I definitely wouldn't be surprised that in the very near future that will change, and National Hurricane Center will at least acknowledge it and give it and give this next tropical wave a possibility of developing into a tropical storm. So I'll keep you guys updated once it changes. Now here's an updated look at what the ensemble members are stating at this time, and I have noticed a pretty key difference in the GFS model ensemble members is that a lot of the ensemble members now want to take this storm a little bit further southward, and we see the storm still fairly strong even compared to yesterday's run, where we'd see this develop not only into a tropical storm but potentially a strong tropical storm, or even a hurricane approaching the Caribbean or even Florida with this one, which is what this one ensemble member is stating. So there's definitely at least something to be aware of at this point. When we see multiple ensemble members, then that means that there could be some indication of tropical cyclone development within the near future. So the Caribbean, definitely at least watch out for this, but we still could see the ensemble members change our forecast quite drastically over the next several days, where we could see it move a little bit further northward, a little southward, or potentially a little weaker or even more powerful than what you see right now, depending on how much ridging there is and how much stable air there will be over the main development region. I'll keep you guys updated. The European model is showing some differences when it comes to the trajectory of some of these ensemble members, because while some do, a decent amount do take it towards a similar trajectory as GFS model and do strengthen it to near GFS ensemble members type strength just to the north of the Caribbean, we see some that take it straight southward, and the further southward it goes, it seems to be a little weaker. And I assume the reason why is because if this were to move further southward, that would mean that there would be a lot more ridging, which would mean that there will be a lot more sinking air, and that would mean that there would be less of a shot of this developing with a higher amount of sinking air. So the further northward it moves, I'll say the more likely we'll see this strengthen. Not really because having the storm move further northward would strengthen it in of itself, but it would represent that there would be less ridging and less stable air, so it would have a higher chance of developing with more lift in the atmosphere. So in terms of my general forecast when it comes to this storm, still fairly similar to yesterday. The ensemble members do want to strengthen this a little bit more compared to yesterday though, which is a little bit concerning. But the GFS model and the European model have mainly maintained their stance when it comes to the strength of this storm, where the GFS model is still believing that this will eventually develop into a tropical storm, while the European model isn't expecting that. But so there's still a decent amount of uncertainty, but I'll definitely keep you guys updated. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.